The bitter wind howled through the cracks of the dilapidated cabin, as Lillian Wright clutched the threadbare quilt around her trembling shoulders, her fever making the harsh Montana winter of 1878 feel even more unbearable. She had nowhere else to go, no one to help her, and as consciousness began to slip away, the cabin door burst open, revealing the silhouette of a tall man with snow dusting his broad shoulders. Thomas Prescott had been tracking a wounded wolf when he spotted smoke from a chimney where no chimney should be. The abandoned Miller homestead had been empty for years, which meant either squatters or someone in desperate trouble. The sight that greeted him confirmed the latter, a woman, pale as death, shivering violently beneath what barely passed for a blanket. "Madam," Thomas called softly, closing the door against the howling blizzard. When she didn't respond, he moved closer, noting her flushed cheeks and the unnatural brightness in her half-closed eyes. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy wool coat and gently laid it over her. "Don't you worry now. I'm going to help you." Lillian was barely aware of the stranger's presence, floating in and out of consciousness as fever ravaged her body. She'd fled Denver 3 days ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever supplies she could hastily pack into her small wagon. The journey had been brutal, and when her horse had gone lame 10 miles back, she'd been forced to continue on foot through the snowstorm until she'd stumbled upon this abandoned cabin. Thomas moved efficiently around the small space, building up the dying fire and melting snow for water. He'd been a cowboy for 15 years, spending most of that time on the open range with only his horse and the stars for company. At 34, he'd seen his share of hardship and death, but something about this woman's vulnerable state stirred a protective instinct in him he hadn't felt in years. As the cabin gradually warmed, Thomas knelt beside the woman, gently pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. "My name's Thomas Prescott," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I work at the Silver Creek Ranch, about 5 miles east of here. Got caught in this storm same as you, I reckon." Lillian's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Lillian," she whispered, her voice as dry as autumn leaves. "Lillian Wright." "Miss Wright," Thomas acknowledged with a nod. "You've got yourself a mighty bad fever. I'm going to look after you until it breaks." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin of willow bark. "This'll help bring down the fever some. Can you sit up to drink it?" With gentle hands, Thomas supported Lillian's back as she sipped the bitter tea. Her hair, the color of sunlit honey, fell in tangled waves around her face. Even ill and exhausted, there was a quiet dignity about her that intrigued him. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed again. "I didn't think anyone would find me here. Just lucky I was tracking that wolf," Thomas replied, carefully laying her back down. He added another quilt from his pack over her, tucking it securely around her shoulders. "Rest now. I'll keep watch." Through the night, Thomas tended the fire and changed the cool cloths on Lillian's forehead. Occasionally, she would wake, disoriented and frightened, and he would speak to her in low, soothing tones until she settled again. By dawn, her fever had begun to subside, and Thomas allowed himself to doze in the rickety chair beside her makeshift bed. When Lillian fully regained consciousness, weak sunlight was filtering through the dirty window. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. She blinked, trying to orient herself, startled to find a man sleeping in a chair next to her. The events of the previous night came back in fragments: the terrible cold, the fever, and then a gentle voice promising safety. Thomas stirred, instantly alert when he saw she was awake. "Morning, Miss Wright. How are you feeling?" "Better," Lillian said cautiously, pulling the quilts tighter around her. "You stayed all night, couldn't very well leave you to fend for yourself," he replied matter-of-factly, rising to check the fire. That fever had a fierce hold on you. Lillian studied him in the growing light. He wasn't what she'd expected from a cowboy. There was a gentleness to his movements that belied his weathered appearance. His face was tanned from years under the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Prescott." "Thomas, please," he corrected, pouring a cup of coffee from the pot he'd set to boil. "And there's no need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." But Lillian knew that wasn't true. She'd learned the hard way that kindness from strangers was rare indeed. "Nevertheless, I'm grateful. I'm not sure I would have survived another night alone." Thomas handed her the cup, their fingers brushing briefly. "Mind if I ask what brings a lady like yourself to this forgotten corner of Montana? Especially in the dead of winter." Lillian hesitated, taking a slow sip of the strong coffee. "I'm running from something, someone." She met his gaze directly, prepared for judgment or suspicion, but found only concern in his clear blue eyes. "Trouble then," Thomas said simply, not pressing for details. "Yes, trouble." Lillian set the cup down with hands that still trembled slightly. "My late husband's business partner. He made certain advances after Daniel died. When I refused him, he became threatening. He's a powerful man in Denver. I had no choice but to leave." Thomas nodded, understanding in his expression. "Well, you're safe here for now. Once you're stronger, I can take you to Silver Creek. The ranch owner, Mr. Holden, is a good man. His wife might have worked for you if you're looking to stay in these parts." "I'd be grateful for the opportunity," Lillian said softly. She'd been a schoolteacher in Denver, but she wasn't above taking whatever honest work she could find. Anything was better than returning to face Vernon Blackwell and his unwanted attentions. Over the next 2 days, Thomas hunted, bringing back rabbit and grouse for stew. He told her stories of his life as a cowboy the cattle drives from Texas to Montana, the characters he'd met along the way, the wild beauty of the untamed land. Lillian found herself laughing more than she had in the year since Daniel's death, drawn to Thomas's quiet strength and unassuming kindness. For his part, Thomas discovered that Lillian was unlike any woman he'd ever met. Educated and refined, yes, but also resilient and practical. She didn't complain about their rough accommodations or the simple food. And when she was strong enough, she insisted on doing her share of the work around the cabin. On the 3rd morning, Thomas announced that the trails would be passable enough to make the journey to Silver Creek. "It's not far," he assured her, "and my horse can carry us both. Are you feeling up to it?" Lillian nodded, already gathering her few belongings. "I'm ready. I've imposed on your kindness long enough." Thomas shook his head. "It's been no imposition, Miss Wright. In fact, it's been—" He paused, searching for the right words. "A pleasant change from my usual solitary ways." Their gazes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Lillian felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with her recovering health. "Still, I'm eager to repay your kindness somehow." "Your company has been payment enough," Thomas replied simply, and Lillian found herself believing him. The ride to Silver Creek Ranch was cold but bright, the landscape transformed into a glittering wonderland by the recent snow. Thomas's horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty, carried them steadily through the drifts, with Lillian seated in front of Thomas, wrapped in his coat and one of the quilts from the cabin. "It's beautiful," Lillian murmured, taking in the vast expanse of white plains and distant mountains. "I can see why you love it here." Thomas's voice came from just behind her ear, warm against the cold air. "It gets in your blood, the openness of it, the freedom." Lillian understood. After the confining propriety of Denver society, there was something liberating about this wild country. Perhaps here, she could truly start anew. Silver Creek Ranch turned out to be larger than Lillian had expected, a sprawling main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings spread across a sheltered valley. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, raising his hand in greeting. "That's James Holden," Thomas explained. "He and his wife, Margaret, own the place. Good people." Mr. Holden was a bear of a man with a booming voice that matched his size. "Prescott, beginning to think the wolves got you. 3 days passed when you should have returned." "Got caught in the storm," Thomas explained, helping Lillian down from the horse. "Found Miss Wright here stranded in the old Miller place, sick with fever." Holden's expression softened as he took in Lillian's pale face. "Well, you're both here now, and that's what counts. Margaret will be pleased to have another woman around. Been just her and the ranch hands' wives for too long." Margaret Holden proved to be as kind as her husband, instantly taking Lillian under her wing. "You poor dear," she clucked, leading Lillian into the warm kitchen. 3 days in that drafty old cabin with nothing but Thomas for company. He's a good man, mind you, but about as talkative as a fence post. Lillian smiled, accepting the cup of tea Margaret pressed into her hands. "He was very kind. I owe him my life." Margaret gave her a shrewd look. "Yes. Well, I've never seen Thomas bring a woman back to the ranch before, so I'd say the experience wasn't entirely hardship for him either." Lillian felt her cheeks warm, but before she could respond, James and Thomas entered the kitchen, stomping snow from their boots. "Margaret, I've told Thomas that Miss Wright can stay in the small room off the kitchen until she decides what she wants to do," James announced. "And there's plenty of work if she's of a mind to stay on." "Of course there is," Margaret agreed enthusiastically. "I've been saying for months I need help with the accounts and correspondence, not to mention teaching the children. There are 4 families with young ones here now, and not a proper school for 20 miles. Lillian's heart lifted at the mention of teaching. "I was a school teacher in Denver," she said quietly. "I'd be honored to teach the children." "Well, that settles it," James declared with a satisfied nod. "You'll stay and teach. We can convert part of the storage room in the main house for a classroom." Thomas, who had been quietly watching the exchange, caught Lillian's eye and gave her a small, private smile that sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, fate had led her to precisely where she needed to be. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Lillian's life. She threw herself into establishing the small school, working with the ranch families to create a suitable learning environment for the 8 children who would be her students. Margaret proved to be not just an employer but a true friend, sharing the history of Silver Creek and introducing Lillian to the rhythms of ranch life. Thomas, meanwhile, maintained a respectful distance. His duties as foreman kept him busy with the cattle and horses, especially as the winter slowly gave way to spring. But Lillian often caught him watching her from across the yard, and occasionally he would bring her small gifts, early wildflowers, a particularly smooth stone from the creek, a wooden pencil box he'd carved himself for her schoolroom. One evening in early April, as Lillian was returning from the newly established schoolhouse, she found Thomas waiting by the garden gate, his hat in his hands. "Evening, Miss Wright," he greeted her, a hint of nervousness in his usually steady voice. "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk. The sunset promises to be especially fine tonight." Lillian's heart quickened. "I'd like that very much, Thomas." They walked in comfortable silence to a small rise overlooking the ranch, where the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Thomas spread his coat on a flat rock for her to sit on, then settled beside her, close but not touching. "I've been meaning to thank you," Lillian said after a moment. Thomas looked surprised. "For what?" "For saving my life, of course. but also for bringing me here to Silver Creek. I never thought I'd find a place where I belonged again after Daniel died." Thomas nodded slowly. "And do you belong here, I mean?" "I'm beginning to think so," Lillian admitted, meeting his gaze. "The people here have been so welcoming. The children are eager to learn, and it's beautiful, just as you said it would be." "I'm glad," Thomas said simply, but the warmth in his eyes spoke volumes. "This land has a way of healing broken spirits. I know it did for me." "Were you broken once?" Lillian asked softly. Thomas looked out over the valley, his profile strong against the dying light. "I came west after the war, saw too much death, did things I'm not proud of. Thought I'd never feel whole again." He paused, reaching down to pick up a small wildflower that grew between the rocks. "But the mountains and the open sky, they have a way of putting things in perspective." He twirled the delicate blue flower between his fingers before offering it to her. "Some things are worth fighting for, worth protecting." Lillian accepted the flower, their fingers brushing. "Yes, they are." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since those first days in the cabin. Thomas slowly, cautiously, placed his hand over hers on the rock between them. Lillian turned her palm upward, interlacing their fingers, and they sat together watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The courtship that followed was as steady and unrushed as Thomas himself. He began joining Lillian for Sunday dinners at the main house, escorting her on rides around the property, and bringing books for her small but growing school library whenever he returned from trips to the nearest town. Margaret watched their budding romance with undisguised approval. "That man has been alone too long," she confided to Lillian one afternoon as they preserved early summer berries. "The way he looks at you like you're the water after a long drought does my heart good to see." Lillian blushed, but couldn't deny the truth in Margaret's words. Thomas looked at her as if she were precious, his quiet devotion evident in every small gesture and consideration. And for her part, Lillian found herself falling deeply in love with the honorable cowboy who had rescued her that snowy night. Their first kiss came on a warm June evening as fireflies danced over the meadow grass. Thomas had taken her fishing at the creek and they were walking back to the ranch, their hands swinging between them. "I've been thinking," Thomas said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the path. "A dangerous pastime," Lillian teased gently. Thomas's lips quirked into a smile. "So I've been told." He grew serious again, taking both her hands in his. "Lillian, I know it hasn't been all that long since you lost your husband, and I would never want to rush you or make you uncomfortable. But I need you to know that I'm falling in love with you. Have been since I found you in that cabin." Lillian's breath caught, though she'd hoped, dreamed even, hearing the words aloud made her heart soar. "Thomas, you don't have to say anything," he hurried on. "I just wanted you to know where I stand. I'll wait as long as you need." "Thomas," Lillian said more firmly, squeezing his hands, "I don't need to wait. I've been falling in love with you too." The joy that transformed his face was beautiful to behold. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Thomas leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. His hands came up to cradle her face as if she were made of the finest porcelain, and Lillian melted into his embrace, feeling truly safe for the first time in years. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he whispered. "Someone who makes me want to be a better man." "You already are the best of men," Lillian assured him, her hand over his heart. Their happiness, however, was soon to be tested. In late July, a letter arrived for Lillian from Denver. Margaret brought it to the schoolhouse, her face pinched with worry. "It came with the supply wagon," she explained. "I didn't know you were expecting correspondence." "I wasn't," Lillian replied, staring at the envelope with trepidation. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the Denver postmark sent a chill through her. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. It was from her former neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, warning that Vernon Blackwell had discovered Lillian's general whereabouts and was determined to find her. "He claims you stole valuable documents before fleeing," Mrs. Henderson wrote, "but I fear his true motives are far more sinister. Be vigilant, my dear." Lillian sank into her chair, the letter clutched in her white-knuckled hand. She had taken nothing but what was rightfully hers: her clothes, her mother's jewelry, and Daniel's personal journal. Could Blackwell truly believe she had stolen business documents? "Bad news?" Margaret asked gently. "The man I fled from in Denver," Lillian explained, her voice hollow. "He's looking for me. He may be coming here." Margaret's expression hardened. "Then he'll have to get through all of us first. I'll tell James right away." That evening, the Holdens, Thomas, and Lillian gathered in the main house to discuss the situation. James paced the floor, his usual joviality replaced by grim determination. "Your family now, Lillian," he declared, "and we protect our own at Silver Creek." Thomas sat beside Lillian on the sofa, his presence a solid comfort. "What exactly is this Blackwell fellow accusing you of taking?" Lillian shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. The only things I took were my personal belongings and Daniel's journal. He kept records of all his business dealings, but nothing that would be of value to anyone else." "Unless," Thomas said thoughtfully, "there's something in that journal that Blackwell doesn't want known, something that might damage him or his reputation." Lillian's eyes widened as realization dawned. Daniel was concerned about some of their investments in the months before he died. He mentioned discrepancies in the ledgers, money that couldn't be accounted for. James stopped pacing. "So this Blackwell might have been embezzling and your husband was onto him. And now he thinks you have proof," Margaret concluded. "Did you bring the journal with you?" Lillian nodded. "It's in my trunk. I never read it fully. It was too painful after Daniel died." "I think it's time you did," Thomas said gently. "There might be something there that could protect you from his accusations." That night, Lillian sat in her small room, Daniel's leather-bound journal open in her lap. Thomas had offered to stay with her while she read, but she'd needed to do this alone, to face whatever truths lay within these pages. What she found confirmed their suspicions and worse. Daniel had documented systematic fraud by Vernon Blackwell, siphoning funds from their investors into personal accounts. But more disturbingly, Daniel had begun to suspect that his accidental fall on a construction site hadn't been accidental at all. The last entry, dated just days before his death, read, "B. Threatened today when I confronted him. Said accidents happen to those who ask too many questions. I fear for my safety and for Lillian's. Must gather final proof before going to authorities." Tears streamed down Lillian's face as the truth hit her like a physical blow. Daniel hadn't just died, he'd been murdered. And Blackwell hadn't pursued her out of unwanted affection. He needed to silence her and recover the damning evidence in this journal. A soft knock on her door startled her. "Lillian," Thomas's voice was low and concerned. "Are you all right?" She opened the door, the journal clutched to her chest. One look at her tear-stained face and Thomas stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "He killed Daniel," Lillian whispered brokenly. "And now he's coming for me." Thomas gently took the journal, glancing at the final entries before setting it aside and gathering Lillian into his arms. "He won't touch you," he vowed fiercely. "I swear it on my life." Lillian clung to him, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "What do we do?" "We take this to the proper authorities," Thomas said firmly. "These are serious accusations with real evidence. The territorial marshal passes through Carson City next week. James and I will take you there." Lillian nodded against his chest, her fear gradually giving way to resolve. Daniel deserved justice, and she deserved to live without looking over her shoulder. The journey to Carson City was tense but uneventful. Marshal Davis, a grizzled veteran lawman, reviewed the journal with grave attention. "This is compelling evidence, Mrs. Wright," he acknowledged. "Enough for me to issue a warrant for Blackwell's arrest on suspicion of embezzlement and possibly murder." He fixed Lillian with a penetrating stare. "But cases like this aren't simple. Men with money have ways of twisting the law. Are you prepared for what might come?" "I am," Lillian replied steadily, Thomas's hand warm and supportive at the small of her back. "My husband deserves justice." "Then I'll send telegrams to Denver immediately," the marshal promised. "In the meantime, I suggest you continue about your business as usual. I'll personally ride to Silver Creek when I have news." The waiting was the hardest part. August stretched into September, and still no word came from Marshal Davis. Lillian threw herself into preparing for the new school term, while Thomas and the other ranch hands worked tirelessly bringing in the hay before the first frost. It was on a golden afternoon in late September when the lookout spotted riders approaching 3 men, moving fast. James ordered the women and children into the main house while the ranch hands took up defensive positions. Thomas positioned himself on the porch beside Lillian, his rifle ready but not raised. "Stay behind me," he murmured, "no matter what happens." As the riders drew closer, Lillian's breath caught. The man in the lead was unmistakably Vernon Blackwell, his corpulent figure incongruous on the wiry cowpony. Beside him rode 2 hired guns, their expressions cold and professional. "That's him," she whispered to Thomas. "Blackwell." James stepped forward as the riders halted in the yard. "State your business, gentlemen." Blackwell's gaze swept past him, fixing on Lillian with undisguised malice. "I've come for Mrs. Wright and some property she stole from me. This doesn't concern you, sir." "Mrs. Wright is under my protection," James replied evenly. "And I believe Marshal Davis has some questions for you, Mr. Blackwell. Why don't you ride on to Carson City and speak with him directly?" A flicker of unease crossed Blackwell's face before his features hardened. "I don't know any marshal, and I don't take orders from ranch hands. Mrs. Wright has stolen valuable business documents that belong to me. I'm taking her back to Denver to face charges." "That's not going to happen," Thomas said, stepping forward, his voice deadly calm. "The only one facing charges will be you, for embezzlement and the murder of Daniel Wright." Blackwell's face purpled with rage. "How dare you? You have no authority, but I do." The new voice came from the side of the barn, where Marshal Davis emerged with 2 deputies. "Vernon Blackwell, you're under arrest for the murder of Daniel Wright and multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement." Blackwell's hand twitched toward his coat, but the marshal's deputy already had his weapon trained on him. "I wouldn't," the deputy warned softly. "This is absurd," Blackwell blustered, though Lillian could see the calculation in his eyes. "You can't possibly have evidence." "Oh, but we do," Marshal Davis interrupted. "Mrs. Wright provided your former partner's journal, which contained some very interesting observations. And once we started investigating in Denver, well," he shrugged. "It's amazing how quick your associates were to talk once they realized the noose was tightening." For a breathless moment, Lillian thought Blackwell might resist. His face contorted with hatred as he stared at her, but eventually he raised his hands in surrender. The deputies moved in swiftly, disarming and restraining both Blackwell and his hired guns. "You'll hang for this, Lillian," Blackwell snarled as they led him away. "One way or another." "The only one swinging will be you," Marshal Davis replied coldly. I'd save your threats, Blackwell. You'll need your breath for your trial. As the marshal and his deputies departed with their prisoners, the tension in the yard slowly dissipated. Thomas turned to Lillian, concern etched on his features. "Are you all right?" Lillian realized she was trembling, the full weight of what had just happened crashing over her. For nearly 2 years, she had lived in fear, first of Daniel's increasingly volatile business partner, then as a widow being pursued, and finally as a fugitive. Now it was over. "I think I will be," she said softly, leaning into Thomas's strength. "For the first time in so long, I think I truly will be." That evening, after the excitement had died down and the ranch had returned to its normal routines, Thomas asked Lillian to walk with him to their special spot on the ridge. The setting sun bathed the landscape in a warm glow, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and sage. "I've been carrying this for weeks," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small wooden box, waiting for the right moment. He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "Lillian Wright, from the moment I found you in that cabin, shivering under that thin quilt, something in me knew you were special. I never believed in love at first sight until then." Lillian's heart pounded as Thomas knelt before her, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small, perfect sapphire. "I'm not a wealthy man," he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I can't offer you grand houses or fine things. But I can promise to love you every day for the rest of my life, to protect you with everything I am, and to build a life with you here, where we both found healing." He swallowed hard. "Will you marry me, Lillian?" Tears of joy spilled down Lillian's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." His face lit with such joy that Lillian felt her heart might burst. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, then rose to his feet and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed. "I love you," he murmured against her lips, "more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," Lillian replied, her hands framing his beloved face. "My protector, my salvation, my heart." They were married 2 weeks later in the Silver Creek ranch house, with James performing the ceremony and Margaret serving as Lillian's matron of honor. The entire ranch turned out to celebrate, the schoolchildren scattering wildflower petals and the cowboys offering a rowdy but heartfelt toast to the couple's happiness. Thomas had been working in secret with James to build them a small house of their own on a picturesque corner of the ranch property, overlooking both the creek and the distant mountains. It was there he carried Lillian that night, across the threshold of their new home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Prescott," he said softly, setting her gently on her feet in the center of the main room. Lillian turned slowly, taking in the simple but beautifully crafted furniture, the cheerful curtains Margaret had helped her sew, the stone fireplace already crackling with a welcoming blaze. On the mantel sat 2 items that brought fresh tears to her eyes: the thin quilt she'd been huddled under when Thomas found her, and beside it, the heavier one he'd laid over her that night. "You kept them," she whispered, touching the fabric reverently. "I wanted us to remember," Thomas said, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "How something beautiful can begin even in the darkest moments. How finding you, cold and alone in that cabin, would lead to the greatest happiness of my life." Lillian turned in his arms, rising on tiptoe to kiss him with all the love in her heart. "Our beginning," she agreed softly. "In the years that followed, Silver Creek Ranch prospered, as did the small school that grew alongside it." Lillian and Thomas welcomed 2 children of their own, a son with his father's steady nature, and a daughter with her mother's quick mind and determination. Their home became known as a place of warmth and welcome, the door always open to travelers and neighbors alike. Sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howled through the valley, Thomas would find Lillian standing at the window, lost in thought. He would wrap a quilt around her shoulders, not the thin one from the cabin, but a beautiful hand-stitched one Margaret had made for their wedding, and hold her close. "Remembering?" he would ask softly. "Always," Lillian would reply, leaning back against his solid warmth. How a stranger's kindness changed everything. How love found me when I least expected it. And as the years turned their hair gray and their faces lined with the memory of both sorrows and joys, Thomas and Lillian Prescott remained each other's steadfast shelter, their love a testament to that snowy night when a woman shivered under a thin quilt, and a cowboy laid another over her and kept watch beside her, neither knowing they had just begun the greatest journey of their lives.